I'll take just a very quick minute by way of introduction. And unfortunately, we just did this last minute, literally last minute in the last 5 or 6 hours. So just for your benefit, Vijay. John Wilkinson is a poet, he's a literary editor, and he's a professor in the Department of English at the University of Chicago. And once he starts to speak, you'll see that he really is English British. He's also the director of the program in creative writing, and he's the chair of the divisional committee on poetics. He has worked prolifically across literary criticism, and he has his own collections of poems as well, and he has a few more on the way. And Vijay, here's the grand surprise that we've prepared for you. He's still on there, so now you can be on screen.
Oh my God! Hi, Jeet.
Hi, Vijay. Serendipity.
I kind of knew it was you.
We've just been having a conversation, so we managed to persuade Jeet to sit in on this conversation. And it's great to welcome you to Canto. I see that you have offered a title of Poetic Time and Timeless Poetry. Because I haven't been in conversation with you before the session, I don't know if you're hoping to or intending to give a short talk, or whether we should just start by talking about timelessness or time in poetry.
I mean, I have to confess that was Lena's suggestion, and she had kind of said she'd just kick off the conversation, and she also suggested that I read something, but I can forego that and we can just jump into talking, because I don't necessarily have anything specific that I mean, I do of course have things that are specific to the topic, but it might be a little too elaborate to make a connection, and I'm sort of, we had a conversation and we were going to pick up on that, but I don't think I can reconstruct what our discourse had been at this point. So we should just sort of start anew and improvise, I guess. If that's
well,
okay.
that's fine. I mean, it'd be great if you would read something at some point, but we'll see how it goes to begin with. And noticing that you live in Brooklyn, as I assume that you still do, and have been a long-time resident of New York, when I think about time and timeliness and crossing time in poetry, the first poem I always think of is Frank O'Hara's The Day Lady Died, given that it's a poem which presents questions about the time of composition. It asserts the time of composition, but that's a fiction. It talks about clock time and the times of trains. The poem's own temporality is constructed around anxious distraction followed by extended pauses and resumption of anxious distraction. And it ends up with a moment of temporal suspension, which is associated both with aesthetic experience in listening to Billie Holiday and death, and also the end of the poem and the suspension of the poem and so on. So maybe that will be somewhere I could invite you to start talking about your relationship to time in the United States and New York, time in India and how you might feel they differ, and your relationship to New York School poetry, because I know you're an admirer of James Schuyler as well as of John Ashbery.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great starting off point. In fact, it'll allow me to read a poem that is very pertinent. I feel like I should, I mean, I was, and I should say something about this issue because I grew up sort of as a reader of poetry during kind of the heyday of the New York School, and especially Ashbery, the coterie Ashbery, the Ashbery before Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, the Ashbery of The Double Dream of Spring and Rivers and Mountains. And I found when I really came to my own, insofar as I've ever come to my own as a poet, that it was through the rejection of not just the hermeneutics, but the specific relationship to time that defines the Ashbery school, not the New York school, not necessarily Ashbery, because, you know, this group of poets is a congeries. It's not exactly a school, and to call it a school is probably, you know, misprisoning their actual character and their differences. But I kind of had that notion of the moment and the immediate, like I'm going to go out and have lunch with, you know, Leroy Jones, and I'm going to come back to my office at the Museum of Modern Art and write a poem about it, right? And that, you know, that kind of immediacy is, of course, I recognized that. It didn't take me long to recognize that that kind of poem is as artificial as a snapshot, right? A snapshot suggests it captures the moment, you know, but there is no such thing as the moment as it's captured by a snapshot, you know. Time unfolds in an entirely different way to our visual experience, you know. So a photograph, which seems the most immediate artifact, is actually the most artificial. And I kind of was always playing around with that paradox. I learned from the New York poets, but I think what I learned from them was a certain kind of energy, a certain kind of relationship to the English sentence. I didn't necessarily buy into their notions of time, but I did write a poem at one point that was an attempt to write a New York School poem. And I'll read it and we can talk about it, because it's very much connected to the notions of time you were bringing up. It's called, appropriately, This Morning. First, I had 3 apocalyptic visions, each more terrible than the last. The graves open and the sea rises to kill us all. Then the doorbell rang and I went downstairs and signed for 2 packages. One just an envelope, but the other long and bulky, difficult to manage. Both for my neighbor Gus. "You're never not at home," the FedEx guy said appreciatively. It's true. I don't shave or even wash. I keep the air conditioners roaring. Though it's summer, one of the beautiful red and conifer green Bayside fuel oil trucks that bed down in the depot by the canal was refreshing the subsurface tanks with black drafts, wrung from the rock, blood of the rock, sucked up from the crevices. The driver looked unconcerned. Leaning slightly on each other, Frank and Louise stepped over his hose and walked by slowly, on the way to their cardiologist.
As much a New York poem as it's possible to get, I think, especially Frank and Louise, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frank and Louise.
Somehow, you know, just immediately get a sense of downtown New York, or maybe the East Village or something.
Well, it's very much a Brooklyn poem, you know. And it's also very much a highly contrived poem that seems to be absolutely of the moment, right? You know, all of those images are disparate. They come from different times, but they're sort of, you know, fixed in what is essentially a snapshot poem. What's essentially a kind of Frank O'Hara, well, I walked out and this is what I saw. And I'm putting it down in a poem. And, and I was kind of, when I was writing the poem, I was playing with the notion of immediacy and artificiality and the idea of, which I'm not parodying it because I revere the impulse to sort of understand that this flow that we live in, this temporal flow, is what's real and is only the only thing that is actually real, and the ways in which the New York school developed that idea, and going back to John Cage and forward to, a whole set of considerations that had to do with American society at that time, that we're just going to free ourselves from all of the historicity that American poetry had gotten tangled up in, in the 40s and the 50s. And, these were the 60s and this was just new. And we were going to do something completely fresh having to do with our immediate experience. So the poem is really concerned with all of those things, but it was written, 30 years after the New York School. So there's something inevitably ironic about my relationship to that history and my relationship to that notion of what temporality in poetry is, what it should be,
Quickly talk about your beginnings as a poet, because you had the most unlikely kind of apprenticeship. You were a fisherman, you worked in Oregon, you then went to university, and I think with the poems from the first book, Wild Kingdom, and the long poem that won the Bernard Connors Prize, you kind of arrived in the very center of a kind of New York poetic milieu. And I'm thinking of this today especially because I noticed that you are part of the tribute to Richard Wilbur. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about those early years and arriving into that world of New York poetry.
Yeah, I guess because I'm talking to, actually, I don't know what audience I'm talking to, but I'm just going to assume that I'm talking to an Indian audience, that I have to make it clear, and I'm, the writing I'm doing now, I'm trying to make it clear to myself that all of this experience and my relationship to poetry and my relationship to the avant-garde, which has always been vexed, I had breakfast at the beginning of the week with Charles Bernstein, who lives in my neighborhood too, and and I think we look at each other from across some sort of great divide, but we enjoy having breakfast. And but we both recognize that all of our allegiances derive from the tremendously revolutionary period in America in which we grew up, the 1960s. And everything having to do with the choices I made in terms of being a writer came from that. And I had been an undergraduate before I became a part of the counterculture. And I had read then and was committed to a lot of art that was highly progressive in that period. An example I can give you is the music of Eric Dolphy. And I listened to Eric Dolphy, always. I didn't. Coltrane was someone who was kind of traditional for me in relationship to my early allegiances in jazz. And it was during that period that I lived out in Oregon and was a part, not necessarily, I was a fisherman, yeah, but I was really a part of a kind of back to land American movement, which was, you know, a product of the incredible trauma of the Vietnam years, you know, which it's hard to sort of recreate for example, my students, how intense that era was, and how it forced so many of us to alter paths that we otherwise might have taken. You know, and you know, in the aftermath of that, I came back to New York and sort of saw the ideological conflicts in the literary world and their relationship to the political conflicts in the literary world, and I just kind of realized I needed a place for myself that was different. That, you know, being an Indian, being an immigrant, you know, I mean, I came here when Eisenhower was president, but I was still an immigrant, and I still am. You know, I couldn't really take on this sort of allegiances and identifications that I would have been able to if I had been a native born American of that period. You know, that someone like Ashbery, however much I found him interesting as a writer, was not really someone who answered to my experience. And the people I found who were useful to me, I started reading Auden again. And I had been reading Elizabeth Bishop, but she became particularly pertinent when I got back to New York because I had to readjust my relationship to the social order. You know, I was comfortable in the counterculture, but I was no longer in the counterculture. I was now living in New York society, you know, with its hierarchies, with its kind of, you know, its obsessive concern with status, you know, its insider ethos, all those things, you know, to which I had an odd relationship. So I think that determined my choices. I mean, Auden sort of protected me and Bishop sort of protected me. And, you know, I've mostly written out of that bag ever since. I've never really changed. You know, I've elaborated for my own sake those ideas I got and clung to from them. But you know, and I kind of think it's a default poetry. And I would say, interestingly enough, that, you know, thinking about, say, Indian poetry in English, you know, which you write, Jeet, that it is a default aesthetic. You know, it's, you know, which is not a bad thing. You know what I mean? I mean, would you agree with that?
I think it is a default aesthetic to write English poetry in India, you know, and it has some kind of immediate, I don't want to say knee-jerk, but it is knee-jerk in a way, and especially thinking in terms of Auden and Yeats and the mid-20th century British poets. It's something that no Indian poet writing in English of a certain age, and I'm thinking anyone over the age of about 40, was able to ignore, because those were the poets who, they were really the only books that were available in India for those decades. And those were the poets that you had to write against or write for or write through. And yeah, I think it is a default really, but maybe the writing of poetry is a default, you know.
Yeah,
it's a protection and a survival and a strategy, a survival strategy.
I'm interested that jazz made a difference, because the obvious difference for me, listening to recordings of you reading your poems from Auden and Bishop, is a rhythmic one. It's quite different rhythmically from those poets, and indeed reminds me more of Dolphy's Out to Lunch. There's a kind of loping rhythm which is able to accommodate the jagged and the dissonant along the way, but where the loping rhythm continues to be able to take in almost anything, as though you were able to walk around the urban landscape or the temporal landscape and just bring anything into this sense of continuity and flow, which is never quite disrupted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. You were breaking up a little, so I couldn't quite.
The influence of jazz on the rhythms of your poetry and how that distinguishes it from Auden and Bishop, for example.
Right. I mean, the great thing I got from jazz, I mean, the history of my listening to music is very, very chaotic. The great thing I got from jazz was the emphasis on vocalization, right? And the history of jazz really is so caught up in that making, the way in which Billie Holiday tried to sound like Lester Young and Lester Young tried to sound like Billie Holiday, and that everybody, that there was this kind of constant symbiosis between vocalization and instrumental music. And also that sense of speed and movement, and that's translated, I think, in American poetry in ways that are really interesting. I mean, Schuyler is an example of the way in which speed and variation mingle with each other. And I think those aspects of jazz were things I retained, long after I stopped really paying attention to jazz, because I think by the time I got to New York, a whole era of jazz was ending, and a new era of jazz was beginning. I mean, that was the beginning of, jazz at Lincoln Center and Wynton Marsalis, and, jazz as a kind of, as an art form that now was going to be put in a museum and was going to subsequently represent, identity in a more politicized way. I mean, the jazz of someone like Cecil Taylor was very political, but it was political of another era, right? And the Cecil Taylor era was ending, and Eric Dolphy had died long ago, and jazz at Lincoln Center was beginning. And I never kind of pursued jazz as something that I listened to regularly, because I came back to New York and there were many, many more musical offerings, so to speak. And I started exploring opera, and I started exploring European music much more deeply because I was in New York, So I retain nothing of jazz beyond that kind of inner understanding of vocalization and its relationship to rhythm and sound, and that was really useful. And I don't know if that's something that mid-century poets like Bishop or Robert Lowell or, American Auden as opposed to British Auden, were really aware of. I mean, they were latently aware of it, but I don't think they were, consciously aware of it in the way that I was. And, I mean, I think their allegiances, the allegiances I kind of obtained from them were, I think, the allegiances that I would call ethical in some way, that they had to do with a certain sort of fidelity to the image and a certain kind of, and also a fidelity to the romantic vocation of the conversational tone, which also connects very much to jazz. Jazz is very much a spoken music, right?
I was saying that the idea of the very long line juxtaposed with a very short line, where the length of the lines vary so much and kind of lead your eye down the page in this vertiginous kind of descent, and that sense of improvisation that line length, the varying line length gives you. I think that's absolutely, now that you mention it, something to do with jazz, and something to do with the fact that Lowell and Bishop, I doubt if they listen to jazz much, and which is why those stanzas are so kind of carved in stone, and that you rarely see the line length varying. With Bishop sometimes, but certainly much less experimental, I think.
Yeah.
Many of your poems have that varying line length. That's something that you see in American poetry later in the 20th century.
This is the kind of rich discussion that is completely open-ended, right? Because another thing that strongly influenced me, which connects to certainly the way in which jazz actually influences American poetry, is the idea of the poem on the page as a field of energy, right? I mean, the real issue in 20th century poetry has to do with the fact that once you've lost the determinative effect of a metrical norm, you have to find another principle by which to arrange the poem sonically. And free verse is successful insofar as it has an overall sound design. And that overall sound design somehow is reflected in the choices line by line that the poet is making with respect to rhythm. That in the classic Olson poetry page, you're sort of, and the classic Pound poetry page, the poetry page of the cantos, you're thinking about, the overall movement of the poem, and then you're working back to what you're going to do with the lines individually. And that becomes very, very vital in terms of its connection with jazz, but it also has to do with its connection to the page, and if you're talking about long lines and short lines, I always really love visually the ragged edge, the ragged right margin. I mean, I found that satisfying, and I can almost, we all three of us write poetry. Somehow there's a kind of nervous energy that one has as a poet that feels right in the way that the lines are falling when they're falling properly. That there's this sort of reflection of some deep physiological aspect of the way one's mind moves and works and thinks. And then that has to be organized in relationship to the sound design too. All of these things have to relate to each other somehow. And I always thought these problems were vexed. And I think the long and the short lines gave me a way of negotiating the poem as it's going down the page in relationship to, all of these vexed issues of the larger sound design and, the arrangement of the page in such a way that it becomes interesting. And the general problem, which is always the problem of writing, of what to put down next, right? What's the next step you're going to take, because you're always stepping into the void. And it was serviceable. I mean, my kind of ideas, I think, are sort of They're very practical ideas. There's nothing ideological about them. And the absence of ideology, I think, has sort of helped me. You know. Again, I come back to Charles Bernstein. I don't know if the audience knows him. He's sort of the doyen of American language poetry, and a poet very much concerned with the nature of abstraction in language. And but he too has sort of changed. He's looking back over his work and seeing it in an entirely different way, and those sort of commitments. And it's interesting. And I think it's interesting in relationship to kind of what you were saying about Indian poetry, Jeet, and the idea of a default poetry, which interests me very much, that the valorization in the West is of the avant-garde, but the rear guard might be just as interesting and maybe even more interesting, right? There's so much that people abandon, which is kind of fascinating, and of course now we are in the great age of recycling. We need to recycle everything. You can't just throw stuff away anymore.
Well, you also, I think, have gained some idea of that from jazz, because your poems have, and I'm just going on what I can find on the internet, so forgive me for my slight acquaintance, but taking existing standards, so as to speak, with Life of Savage or My Favorite Things, and improvising off those and bringing them into the present. But strangely enough, Charles Bernstein's recent work is increasingly using very popular American song forms and so on,
Sure.
And repurposing them.
I guess that material, going back to jazz, I think the one jazz artist who remains for me endlessly fruitful and to whom I listen not only for pleasure but for inspiration is Ella Fitzgerald. And Ella Fitzgerald is at the center of the Great American Songbook, right? And she is the most quote unquote natural, of all 20th century singers. And if I were to extend that, the people who really always helped me as a poet are in fact singers. Not just Ella Fitzgerald, but Schwarzkopf or Lubavitch or, Peggy Lee or, Barbara Cook, and these are people who are kind of, they're interpreters of a song tradition that exists. And it's in their interpretations that I find the deepest expression of the individual character of the artist and the thing that I keep looking back towards. The fact that I kind of reference the book in my poems, and certainly in the new book, there are constant references to those songs, is incidental to the fact that I listen to these people. I listen to Ella Fitzgerald, I listen to Peggy Lee, because I need to remind myself constantly of what natural vocalization is, of what it is to get the right sound coming off the page. A natural tone, a conversational tone that is nevertheless highly musical, And Ella, I think, is kind of, she's basically the Elizabeth Bishop of jazz. Very closely related to each other in terms of what they want, in terms of how they want the to sound to the audience. Yeah, they're crucial in that way.
Interesting, because one of the things that you're told as a musician, when you're a young musician and you take your first lessons as an instrumentalist, instrumentalists, not singers, I'm talking about instrumentalists, are told, especially when you're soloing, the thing that you have to be is a human voice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the vocalist that you are trying to be as an instrumentalist. So I can absolutely see the connection between a poet and a poet interested in vocalists in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that points to the fact you're talking about the voice effect of the poem rather than the poet as a directly unmediated voice. I get very irritated by talk about the speaker of the poem as though that's identical with the poet. What you're doing is producing a voice or vocalizing through the instrument of the poet.
This is something that's historical, right? It goes back to the Romantics. But in each generation, somehow the voice has to be recreated. The quote unquote naturalness of the voice, the conversationalness of the voice. It has to be rediscovered both in the individual poet and, in the poetics collectively understood. The larger sort of, the macroscopic world of poetry where there are ideological conflicts tends to resolve quite easily in the microscopic world where, whatever the ideology of the poet, they're still dealing with this issue of vocalization, and they're still, whether they know it or not, committed to natural speech. And that's something, that's worth a book. And I've always thought, well, I'm going to write a book, like, what's the difference between Swinburne and Yeats, right? The difference between Swinburne and Yeats is that, Yeats is so committed to the prose order. And he's committed to the prose order because the prose order allows him to seem as if he's speaking naturally and immediately. And that constitutes as different from Swinburne, even though they're 10 or 15 years between them. And, but it's a radical transformation, and it's retrospective in that he's looking back at the Romantic tradition and saying, this is what's essential about it. And he extracts that, and that becomes hugely influential. It becomes very, very influential in American poetry. If you look at the poets who came to maturity in the 1950s, across the board, they're influenced by Yeats. They won't consciously, celebrate that influence to a great extent because, of course, Yeats is politically problematic to them. But underneath, it's all kind of Yeats, and it's this issue that Yeats solved that problem, and that other people picked it up, and then that becomes the problem that when you're sitting down and writing the poem, you're always working on, whether you're writing something like a language poet would write, or whether you're writing something, like a very traditional sort of confessional poet of this era would write.
But Ashbery is closer to Swinburne, I'd have thought.
Yeah.
I think
Ashbery is always the most interesting case, right? He's always the, And he always said, well, my great influence was Auden, not Stevens.
But early Auden.
Yeah. But then Ashbery was always blowing smoke too,
Yeah, you never knew what to believe.
Yeah.
Also, absolutely right about the 50s, the poets in America in the 50s looking to Yeats or working off Yeats. I remember the Berryman line, I forget which poem, where he refers to Yeats as the great shade, from the shade from which the American poet must emerge.
Yeah, it's interesting. Certain poets, I'm doing, it's the 60th anniversary of Sylvia Plath's death, and Hunter College is having an event in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to participate in it. And she really seems to be very new and interesting to me to this moment, in terms of what we're talking about, the way the poem is a field of energy, the way in which the individual self vocalizes itself, and the kind of sound she gets to come off the page. I mean, she's really unusual, and I don't think we've kind of quite understood, because of all of the mythology that surrounds her and all the controversy. I don't think there's been a sufficient appreciation of how great a poet she actually is. How kind of significantly she altered the trajectory of poetry in English.
Oddly enough, she indirectly influenced Charles Bernstein. He was very influenced by Veronica Forrest Thompson's book, Poetic Artifice, which is centered on a rereading of Sylvia Plath as a kind of structuralist poet, and trying to rescue her from the malign grip of Ted Hughes as she saw it.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. I'll have to, look at that before I do this. And yeah, I mean, there's something that, the problem we all face is, like, we sit down to write and we sound like what we've read, right? And then we somehow have to get beyond that. And she managed to do it so decisively, so completely.
It sounds to me as though one of the things from the beginning of our talk you've been talking about is your determination to escape the prison of the contemporary. And I'm very struck that most of the students I teach will only read contemporary poetry and believe that that's the only place in which they can find anything that is vital. And I'm always sort of struggling to say, well, actually, the really radical stuff can be still found in the canon, if you can break it open in certain ways, and indeed in rediscovered and refound poetry, neglected poetry. But that the contemporary, if you just write knowing only your contemporaries, at best your writing is going to be representative of its time, and that is no ambition.
I'm going to add one thing to that. I was a student of Vijay's in the early 2000s at Sarah Lawrence College, and we were given these reading lists by various professors, all of whom were poets. And most of those reading lists, in fact, had these overlaps. There were poems that were taught by almost everybody. But Vijay's reading list was entirely different in that it was to do with classical work. And it began with Plato. And in fact, I think the first lecture that you gave us in that semester was a study of Plato. And it had almost nothing to do with poetry, but it set an absolutely kind of classical context within which to read contemporary poetry. I think that's what I took away from that class.
Well, Pound said that all poetry is contemporary, right?
If you make it new.
You invent your tradition.
Right. literature is news that stays news. And it's not really, poetry doesn't seem to have that much centrality in the culture, certainly not of the order it did, say, when I was their age, when American poetry was really kind of very exciting and alive, and had a lot of ways in which it was making its presence felt in the culture. You know, I sort of feel like at this point, there is not that kind of energy, not because there isn't a lot of poetry being written, and not because there isn't a lot of good poetry being written, but because things are so diffuse, and there are so many coteries, and there's so much fragmentation, and I don't quite know why they read what they read, you know, and I don't know where they're getting their enthusiasms from, and I don't know if I'm being if I'm showing my age and finding it a little deplorable, you know, that, you know, I mean, they don't read Ashbery. I mean, they don't read someone like, you know, say Tori Dent, who they would have read 10 years ago. They don't even know who she is. And which is sad, because Tori Dent was a really interesting poet of the 1990s, you know, was sort of, you know, died and now has disappeared. So it's bewildering. It's a moment that's bewildering, and I think it's probably going to become more bewildering.
Who are they reading?
I don't know. They're reading Ocean Vuong. They're reading, you know, various poets who are, I guess, for want of a better word, I would call identitarian.
Sure.
You know, and that seems to be the kind of hermeneutic structure by which choices are made, you know. And I think the idea, you know, that, and everybody is lamenting this, that the death of humanistic study itself. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's true or not. It might be overstated, but you know, one of the assumptions of humanistic study was that there's a continuity between the past and the present, and that certainly has sort of broken down in the minds of young people, and I don't think college curricula are necessarily trying to reinforce that notion, you know, the notion of that continuity. And those of us who kind of believe in history don't really know how to, you know, translate that belief to our students. I mean, I keep trying, but I sort of feel like, well, maybe I should just give them what they want instead of trying to impose my ideas onto them, you know. And at least help them write good sentences. So I have a question for you guys. Are you in Delhi or are you in Calcutta or Kolkata?
We're in Delhi.
Oh, you're in Delhi. Okay.
We're at the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. I just happened to be in town.
It's good to see you.
It's great to see you. I found out 10 minutes before this that you were on, and I said, well, I'm not leaving the room in that case.
How are things in India these days?
Worse.
But also better, right, Jeet?
I mean, you know, I think just the act of writing a poem, you have to be hopeful. It's an act of hope, isn't it?
It's amazing to me is having, you know, seen for so many years, many decades now, the very complex and often contradictory American relationship to India. I'm now amazed at the extent to which, especially in terms of foreign policy, America feels they have to be really nice to India.
Well, China is a part of that story, I think.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. The whole China, India, oh my God.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
And in higher education in the UK as well, we no longer have the Chinese graduate students. How do we bring in the money in order to sustain our universities? We have to turn to India.
My Indian students all want to go to Canada.
Why though?
Canada is the new promised land. Well, global warming is making Canada's climate very, very, appealing. Pretty soon it'll be like, the mid-Atlantic up there.
Well, Chicago's got a lot of water still. It'll always have a lot of water, so people can come
Right.
to Chicago.
I know, yeah. 25% of the fresh water in the world in that region.
Yeah, it's the place to be.
Oh my God. Well, in about 10 years, you might have to worry about those water levels rising. Don't buy any seafront property.
Yeah.
Do you want to end with a poem?
What a good idea.
Yeah.
Again.
Maybe, since you're in Delhi, I'll read The Long Meadow.
Oh yeah, lovely. Talking about long and short lines.
Right. So this is the poem that ends the book, The Long Meadow, and it's, my mangling an incident in the Mahabharata. The Long Meadow. Near the end of one of the old poems, the sun of righteousness, the source of virtue and civility, on whose back the kingdom is carried, as on the back of the tortoise the earth is carried, passes into the next world. The wood is dark, the wood is dark, and on the other side of the wood the sea is shallow, warm, endless. In and around it there is no thread of life. So little is the atmosphere charged with possibility that he might as well be wading through a flooded basement. He wades for what seems like forever, and never stops to rest in the shade of the metal rain trees, springing out of the water at fixed intervals. Time, though endless, is also short. So he wades on until he walks out of the sea and into the mountains, where he burns on the windward slopes and freezes in the valleys. After unendurable struggles, he finally arrives at the celestial realm. The god waits there for him. The god invites him to enter. But looking through the glowing portal, he sees on that happy plain not those he thinks wait eagerly for him, his beloved, his brothers, his companions in war and exile, all long since dead and gone. But, sitting pretty and enjoying the gorgeous sunset, his cousin and bitter enemy, the cause of that war, that exile, whose arrogance and vicious indolence plunged the world into grief. The god informs him that yes, those he loved have been carried down the river of fire. Their thirst for justice offended the cosmic powers, who are jealous of justice. In their place in the celestial realm, called Alaukika in the ancient texts, The breaker of faith is now glorified. He at least acted in keeping with his nature. Who has not felt a little of the despair the Son of Righteousness now feels, staring wildly around him? The God watches, not without compassion and a certain wonder. This is the final illusion, the one to which all the others lead. He has to pierce through it himself, without divine assistance. He will take a long time about it, with only his dog to keep him company. The mongrel dog, celebrated down the millennia, who has waited with him, shivered and burned with him, and never abandoned him to his loneliness. That dog bears a slight resemblance to my dog, a skinny, restless, needy, overprotective mutt who was rescued from a crack house by Suzanne. On weekends and when I can shake free during the week, I take her to the long meadow in Prospect Park, where dogs are allowed off the leash in the early morning. She's gray-muzzled and old now, but you can't tell that by the way she runs.
Thank you so much, Vijay, and thank you, Jeet, too, for joining us in this
Such a
conversation.
Thank you for having me.